Alright, hello everyone, my name is Clarke, and this is my presentation on India, past, present, and future. So we're going to start with some quick facts about India. It has the world's second largest population at 1.2 billion, and it also has the 31st largest population density per square mile. Now mind you, even with this high population density in terms of the world, this is vastly offset because large parts of India are agricultural. So many of the industrial and cities of India have a vastly larger population density than the average. Now India also has the third largest GDP of any country with 5.3 trillion US dollars. And one discrepancy is that it has the 133rd largest GDP per capita. So, while it may have this huge economic power as a country, the amount of people in it really offsets that. Now, it also has a Human Development Index of 0.55, which is medium, so that means that in terms of human health and other things like that, it's doing okay. It's certainly far behind more modernized nations, but it's still doing a lot better than other nations. So, a brief history of India is that India used to be a British colony, and the CPO mutiny in 1857 was one of the first real rebellions against that. The CPO mutiny was caused because a rumor went around that the bullet cartridges which the sepoys had to bite into, and a sepoy is a British trained Indian troop, that these bullet cartridges they had to bite into had either cow or pig fat in it, and that's something that is really offensive to Hindus and Muslims respectively. So the sepoys revolted against their British colonialists, and they were really crushed. The mutiny was crushed heavily by the British and actually led to more control of India by the British Empire. And we're going to fast forward a little bit to really the beginning of the Indian nationalism movement, which is the movement of creating India as a country. So in 1930, Gandhi led the salt boycott, which was really a protest against British control of India. And eventually that did lead to Indian independence in 1947, where India declared their independence and became independent from Britain and became their own nation. Now one thing that should be noted, however, is that simultaneously created Pakistan. England did control the entire region, so what they did was they divided it into two countries, one for the Hindus, which was India, and one for the Muslims, which was Pakistan. And they created this border between those two countries really arbitrarily, and that led to many issues leading into the modern day, including the 3 Indo-Pakistani wars of varying years, as you see there. So India, as the world's largest functioning democracy, really starts with the electorate. And you're going to see a lot of parallels to the British system of government, since it was so heavily influenced by their British rule, and also because of that, the American system of government, because of how close we are to the British system. So the electorate directly elects their state legislature and the lower house of parliament, the House of the People. Now, the upper house of the parliament is appointed, chosen by the state legislature. Unlike in America, where we currently, at least, directly elect our upper house, although historically that was not always the case. U.S. senators used to be appointed by state government. Now, both houses of parliament and the state legislature choose the president. Now, I should note that the president is not like the president we have in America. The president is more of a figurehead and has a lot more ceremonial powers than our president does. The president does have some powers, including his responsibility to choose the Supreme Court, to nominate members of the Supreme Court, but that is heavily at the urging and advisement of Parliament. Now, the de facto power within government rests with the Prime Minister, who is also appointed by the President, but mostly the responsibility for the choosing of the Prime Minister comes from the House of the People, the lower house of Parliament. like the British system, the Prime Minister comes from the majority party in the House of the People, or the coalition government in Parliament, depending on the situation. And the Prime Minister chooses his Council of Ministers, which I'll go into when I talk about the Prime Minister in a moment. But I'm going to break this down a bit. So Parliament, like the US and England, it's a bicameral legislature. And the lower house, the one that is directly elected, is the House of the People. That has 545 members, only 2 of which are non-elected, and they serve up to 5-year terms. Now, the way that India and England work in terms of year terms is not like America, where there are fixed terms in this circumstance, but the Prime Minister has the ability to call elections whenever he or she wants, but with it being there can be no more than 5 years without an election. Another point that I want to note is that each representative in the House of the People represents 2 million people each, which is 4 times the amount that a U.S. House of Representatives member has to represent. So that is also kind of showing of India's big population has the effect on government. Now the upper house is the House of the States. It has 250 members, again selected by the state government. 12 of these are non-elected, and they do serve fixed 6-year terms. And I'll also in a little bit go into non-elected positions, these appointed positions. But the Prime Minister is selected by the House of the People and is the part of the most populous party in the House of the People, or chosen by a coalition government. He really runs the day-to-day affairs of the government, kind of in much the same way the U.S. President does. And the Prime Minister oversees his Council of Ministers. Now, a simplistic way you could view the Council of Ministers is kind of a grouping of cabinet officials like we have in the U.S. That is a little bit of an oversimplification, but that is kind of a general idea of how it works. And he chooses his 15 to 20 ministers, depending on kind of how many he chooses and which ones he wants. Now, the Supreme Court of India consists of 26 judges. Again, they are appointed by the president, and they serve until the age of 65. And like in America, they do have the ability of judicial review, which is that they kind of determine what law states. Really, they have the ability to interpret the law. Now, it's difficult to go really any further in India without touching on the caste system. Now, India's caste system is a system of institutionalized social stratification. Well, what does that really mean? Well, that means that kind of part of their way of life, their culture, is this social system where you're each member of a caste, and these are ordered, such that there are higher castes and there are lower castes. And what it means is that it's really difficult to, in Indian society, if not impossible, kind of move up or change your caste. You can't really, in life, move from a lower caste to one even, like, kind of one higher than you, and it's also extremely difficult, if not impossible, to marry into a higher caste or really associate with people of much higher caste than the caste you are in. Now, the government did outlaw discrimination based on caste back in 1950, but as kind of America's history with social shows, just because you outlaw something doesn't make it really so overnight. You can't really outlaw social views. So, certainly at the beginning it was not very effective, this outline of discrimination. This still was a heavy part of Indian society. So the government began kind of incentive programs to help people to help these lower castes. Affirmative action in America would be kind of a good equivalent, and many of these non-elected positions in government that I mentioned earlier are set aside for members of lower castes so they can have some representation in government. Now I'm going to move to one of the topics I have talked about in my blog posts a lot, and what I think is perhaps one of the most interesting parts of Indian relationships. It is the region of Kashmir, as you see on this map here. It is the northern border between India and Pakistan that China actually also partially has on it. China is also a border to this region. And this comes to one of the problems that I mentioned earlier of England kind of arbitrarily drawing this border between India and Pakistan. Kashmir is really a disputed territory between the two, with it being currently a part of India, but Pakistan laying claim to it, and there has been 3 wars over Kashmir. As you saw at the beginning of the timeline I presented, well, the War of 1947, the Indo-Pakistani War of 1947 was a longer one. The other 2 wars were short, partially because of foreign influence, foreign pressure for less violence. Now, this is one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world. You have 1.3 million Indian troops stationed along this border, with 600,000 Pakistani troops stationed on this border also. Now, another player in this is the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front, which is a terrorist organization that fights for Kashmiri independence as a nation, so a kind of a separate Kashmiri nation, rather than it being a part of India or Pakistan. Now, it really is a hot spot for violence. Since 1990, over 43,000 people have been killed in the conflicts over Kashmir. And that includes over 21,000 militants, over 5,000 Indian and Kashmiri security forces, and almost 17,000 civilians. Now, quick thing I should note is that when I say militants, I don't always mean really terrorist in the general sense, like the Liberation Front that I mentioned. It's heavily suspected, and there is some proof to show this, that a lot of these militants are Pakistani trained, and essentially Pakistan recruits, trains people, and sends them over to fight in Kashmir to create disturbances, to really try to push India out, since they cannot really declare war. And once again, these casualty reports are since 1990, and that doesn't include any of the 3 wars over this region fought by those 2 countries. So I'm going to conclude here with questions for the future about India. One of the main ones is India's future with relationship with China. India is perhaps one of the few countries that is really comparable to China in many ways. It has a comparable economy, a comparable population. So the question is India going to start really competing with China much more than it is now? Or are they going to go in a different direction and sacrifice kind of rapid economic growth for more human rights and comfortable living, since India is, in fact, a democracy? Now, as I just spoke about, the Kashmiri conflict is something that we're going to have to look forward to in the future. This constant fight over this region, and as kind of a arms race continues, we're going to need to see what happens, especially with both India and Pakistan getting nuclear capabilities. That could really be a hot spot for setting off some type of massive violence. And also, the future economic development in India is a question. Currently, India is over 50% agricultural. So, in the next decades, are we going to see them moving away from that into more kind of your production, your goods and services, or are they going to kind of hold on to their economic development and agricultural society, and perhaps and will they really continue on a path of really rapid economic growth, or are they going to continue on a path where they, as I mentioned before, sacrifice a certain level of economic development for a kind of more comfortable living? So that wraps up my presentation on India. Thank you, and I would like to thank you all very much for listening. Thank you very much.